Born on the scorching sands of Arabia, Islam was a formidable force from the beginning. In the 7th century, the Prophet Muhammad united the quarreling Arabs under the banner of his new religion. And just 10 years after his death, the armies of Islam had conquered the great cities of antiquity. In fact, the Arabs had already made it to the other side of northern Africa, eventually crossing the Strait of Gibraltar to conquer the Iberian Peninsula. By 638, Arab armies had occupied Jerusalem and most of the Levant, establishing Muslim rule in a place of religious pilgrimage, sacred to both Christians and Jews. However, by 969, the Fatimid Caliphate in Cairo had become the dominant Islamic world power, and its rulers were on friendly terms with nearly every Christian ruler in Europe, and religious pilgrims could safely travel between Europe and the Holy Land under Fatimid rule. Meanwhile, a crisis was unfolding within the Roman Church. The Church was governed by 5 patriarchs, based in Rome, Alexandria, Antioch, Constantinople, and Jerusalem. By the 11th century, however, a glaring contradiction between its Eastern and Western leaders threatened to tear the Christian world apart. In 1050, the Gregorian reform movement sought to increase the growing power of Rome and to expand its political influence through the doctrine of papal supremacy, bringing them into conflict with Christian leaders in the East. To the Eastern Christians, the Bishop of Rome held no more authority than any one of the other 4 church fathers, and they refused to recognize the papacy. The conflict culminated in a permanent schism between the Eastern and Western churches, while mutual orders of excommunication were issued by Pope Leo IX and Michael I of Constantinople against each other. Thus, the Roman Church was divided into 2 rival organizations, establishing Latin Catholicism in the West and the Orthodox Church in the East. But medieval Europe had problems far more serious than this ecclesiastical drama. By the end of the 10th century, feudalism had come to define the social relations of Western Europe, leading to new innovations in agricultural technology, which increased the efficiency of labor to a significant degree. This caused the population of Western Europe to nearly triple by the turn of the 12th century. In medieval Europe, the ruling classes of its many feudal states were groups of noble families whose privilege was determined by birthright. And the difference between the nobility and everyone else was their ownership of land. After all, wealth was determined by how much land one owned, for land contained the means to reproduce the conditions of life on a long-term basis. Whoever had the resources to maintain control of large swathes of land could project their sphere of influence proportional to the amount of land they controlled. Thus, feudalism was a complex network of shaky military alliances among a hierarchy of lesser nobles paying rents to more powerful landlords. And at the top of this social pyramid sat the king and the clergy, for the church was the most powerful landlord of all. The peasants were the majority, and because they themselves did not own land, they were forced to become serfs, living as tenant farmers on the land of a local lord. The surplus these peasants produced was paid to the lord as rent. And the accumulated surplus from all the peasant families on his estate was the foundation of feudal society, and their labor reproduced the conditions of life every day. It allowed the nobility to be free of the labor burden themselves, allowing them to spend all their time in combat training, most of them owing tribute in military service to their direct overlord in exchange for a plot of land carved from the lord's much larger estate. But the feudal system only functioned well when uncultivated virgin land was still available in Europe, and with no more new land, the military feudal nobility grew more desperate to grab a plot of land for themselves, in bitter competition with their rivals. The result was rampant violence in the countryside throughout Western and Central Europe, and the peasants found themselves caught in the middle of these brutal struggles over land. The papacy attempted to mitigate this violence with initiatives such as the Peace of God campaigns, and they often tried to redirect this violence elsewhere by recruiting volunteers to go fight the Muslims in Spain. Still, these efforts made very little difference. Of course, some factions of nobility were worse than others. In particular, the Normans had become notorious for wreaking havoc across continental Europe, and were known to leave a trail of destruction behind them. Their story is almost unbelievable. The word Norman is merely a nickname, derived from Northmen or Norsemen, to reflect their Scandinavian origins. The Normans are the descendants of the original settlers of Normandy, a region of northern France named after the Normans themselves. They were a tribal nation from Denmark, often known as Vikings, and they made their living by launching lightning-fast raids deep into the hinterland of continental Europe, traveling down the rivers in their boats to pillage and loot the towns they found along the riverbank, always departing long before help can possibly arrive. But in 9/11, a Viking warlord named Rollo received a large land grant from the Frankish king Charles the Simple, as part of a deal to end Viking raids in Frankish territory. Initially a duchy, this was the region that would later come to be known as Normandy. And now that they had land, the Vikings had no reason to continue their raids, and settled into a life of agriculture. But the Normans would retain their military traditions and training programs, as they could only maintain control of their duchy as long as they had the military capabilities to defend it. Thus, the Normans remained a distinct group, known for their military prowess and ambition, while adopting the local language and culture of their new home. The Normans quickly integrated with the local Frankish and Gallo-Roman populations, and they converted to Christianity and adopted the French language, along with aspects of the local culture and governance of the region. The Normans quickly earned a reputation as renowned mercenary warriors, highly skilled in cavalry warfare, and they answered to absolutely no one other than themselves. In 1066, William the Conqueror established Norman rule in the British Isles after his successful conquest of England, while other groups of Norman adventurers were busy expanding their influence further south. In southern Italy, Sicily, and other parts of the eastern Mediterranean, military operations led by rogue Norman mercenaries had become a constant thorn in the side of the papacy. Their activities eventually prompted Pope Leo IX to launch a military campaign against them, but the Normans defeated his forces and continued to rampage through Italy as they pleased. But the Normans had a complicated relationship with the Church, and their invasion of Muslim-held Sicily was done under the papal banner In Vexillum Sancti Petrior, or Banner of St. Peter. But the Normans made other enemies in southern Italy as well, and none more bitter than the Greek nobility in Constantinople, the ruling class of the Eastern Roman Empire. The Romans still controlled territories along the Italian coast. That is, until Norman mercenaries started plundering these lands and began seizing their last Italian territories piece by piece. Constantinople attempted to annihilate the Normans militarily, but several Roman armies tried and failed to dislodge them. In particular, the Norman mercenary Robert Guiscard was a notorious nuisance to Constantinople, and he was the most wanted man in the empire for several years. In 1071, Robert Guiscard captured the city of Bari from the Romans. He would remain the #1 enemy of Constantinople throughout the duration of his military campaigns along the eastern Adriatic coast around Dyrrhachium. The Eastern Roman Empire had survived long after the collapse of its western half many centuries earlier, and its capital in Constantinople was the shining jewel of the Christian world. And with its population reaching 500,000 by the beginning of the 12th century, Constantinople was also the largest city in medieval Europe. Since the loss of the West in 476, the Eastern Roman Empire had endured for centuries as a historic center of wealth, culture, and military power. And under the leadership of a ruthless emperor named Basil II, the empire reached the peak of its territorial recovery in 1025, its borders stretching as far as the outskirts of western Iran, encompassing all of Bulgaria and the Balkan region of southern Europe, as well as Anatolia and Greece, the heart of the Eastern Roman Empire. But despite the ongoing conflict on its borders, Constantinople was able to maintain stability for some time. The Roman navy virtually eliminated piracy in the Mediterranean, while the state hired mercenary armies to deal with the empire's many enemies, Christian and Muslim alike. And aside from the Normans in Italy, the biggest threats were groups such as the Pechenegs, the Serbs, and the Cumans on the empire's northern border. And until the end of the 11th century, these threats on the empire's periphery were kept well under control by the army. But that would soon change when the Seljuk Turks came riding into eastern Anatolia to plunder their cities. The Seljuk Turks came from a land in Central Asia called Transoxania, and had converted to Islam relatively recently before migrating to Iran to seek their fortunes. In the following decades, the Seljuk Turks went on to conquer Iran and Mesopotamia, along with swathes of Western Asia. But the Seljuk Turks were very different from the Islamic world. The Turks slept on the hard ground beneath the open sky. They lived as nomads, in constant search of grazing land for their animals, as their people had no history of agriculture, relying instead on their livestock to survive. Most of them still held on to cultural practices that were strictly forbidden in Islam, left over from their native shamanistic religion, and the Seljuk Turks found themselves isolated by their fellow Sunni Muslims. The Turks established the Islamic Sultanate of Rum in eastern Anatolia, and their borders were advancing west towards Constantinople little by little. Intending to halt the Seljuk advance, Eastern Roman Emperor Romanos, the fourth Diogenes, departed the capital with his army and headed east to confront them. It was a catastrophic mistake. The Battle of Manzikert was a total disaster. Not only did Roman forces suffer a humiliating defeat at the hands of the Seljuk Turks, but the emperor himself was captured alive by the enemy. Fortunately for Romanos, his enemy showed him considerable mercy. The Seljuk Sultan was a man named Arpi Arslan, and by all accounts he treated his defeated rival more like his guest than his hostage. Romanos dined at the Sultan's own table, and as soon as the Seljuk ruler received the requested ransom payment from Constantinople, Emperor Romanos was returned to his capital unharmed. But the emperor likely would have chosen death instead, as he already knew what awaited him at home. And just as he had feared, Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes was deposed and then blinded by his political enemies as soon as he returned to Constantinople, a more humane punishment than execution, according to the Greek nobility. After all, Roman law forbade the blind from ruling. Manzikert was a decisive turning point. In the years that followed, the Seljuk Turks captured key cities, first Nicaea in 1081, then Antioch in 1086. But the Seljuk state was plagued with internal problems and did not remain united for long. In 1092, Sultan Nizam al-Mulk died, and his successor Malik Shah was soon to follow. Malik Shah was succeeded by Kilij Arslan, while his brother Tutush I launched a civil war in Syria against his rival Berk Yaruk, who he quickly defeated, allowing Tutush to take power as the Sultan of Syria. But when Tutush was killed in 1095, his sons Ridwan and Dukak took over the provinces of Aleppo and Damascus, respectively dividing Syria between these two rival emirs, while Kerboga, the Atabeg of Mosul, ruled the region of Mesopotamia. Thus, the former Seljuk Empire fractured into rival warlord states. Meanwhile, their Fatimid enemies in Cairo maintained their control of the Levant, until the Seljuk Turks forced them out of the Holy Land and captured Jerusalem in 1073. In 1095, Roman Emperor Alexios I Komnenos sent envoys to the Council of Piacenza in Italy, convened by the Latin Church. Concerned and overwhelmed over the Seljuk threat in the east, Alexios was requesting military aid from the west. And Pope Urban II was eager to assist his fellow Christians in the east. Urban responded favorably, perhaps hoping to heal the schism between the Eastern and Western churches and reunite them under the leadership of the papacy in Rome. In fact, the Pope had already corresponded with Alexios before, and the two of them had been in close contact since at least 1089, and had even discussed the prospect of reunification in their previous correspondence. Pope Urban was enthusiastic about the idea of a holy war in the East, and he set out on a 10-day tour traveling through his homeland in France, where he gathered the support of the most powerful noblemen in Western Europe. The tour culminated in the 10-day Council of Clermont, where Urban delivered an impassioned sermon to a large audience of influential French nobles and clergymen. And while the sources differ somewhat regarding the content of his speech, they all agree that the Pope heavily emphasized the rampant violence that plagued Western Europe due to the constant warfare between rival nobles fighting over control of land. And the implied solution was to redirect the violence away from Europe and to channel it against the Seljuk Turks in the east, where there was plenty of land for ambitious young nobles to carve out their own little kingdoms. Of course, Pope Urban also addressed the ill treatment of Christian pilgrims in the Holy Land. Since capturing Jerusalem in 1073, the Seljuk Turks had made it very clear that tolerance for religions other than their own was not a familiar concept to them. While the cosmopolitan Fatimid regime in Cairo welcomed the economic benefits that came with religious tourism to Jerusalem, the Seljuk Turks came from a world where tribal affiliation was the difference between life and death at any time. And for this reason, They regarded anyone outside of the Sunni sect of Islam as a potential enemy, including those who belonged to the minority Shia sect of Islam. Naturally, Christian pilgrims returning from Jerusalem reported harassment and general oppression by the Turks. Pope Urban thus called for an armed pilgrimage to the Holy Land in his sermon, promising rewards in heaven for those who participated, and the remission of sins to anyone killed in the expedition. According to one source, an enthusiastic crowd responded with cries of Deus lo volt, a Latin phrase that means God wills it. The first crusade was in motion. As soon as Pope Urban finished his sermon, a nobleman named Adhemar of Lopai became the first person to take the cross, in which he swore an oath before the crowd that he would complete an armed pilgrimage to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. He thus became the spiritual leader of the crusade. Adhemar of Lopai was one of the most influential noblemen in southern France, alongside Raymond IV, Count of Toulouse, and both were close allies of the papacy. Urban had discussed the idea of an armed crusade in the east with both Adhemar and Raymond prior to his speech, and he had instantly won their support. The Pope also secured the support of several other powerful individuals, particularly Godfrey of Bouillon and his brother, Baldwin of Boulogne. Also of note was Hugh I, Count of Vermandois, whose brother was the excommunicated Philip I of France, and a nobleman named Robert Curthose, whose own brother was William II of England, along with his relatives Stephen II of Blois and Robert II, Count of Flanders. In addition to the most powerful people in France, the Pope also secured the support of influential Norman mercenaries within the nobility of southern Italy, including Bohemond of Taranto and his nephew Tancred, both eager to carve out their own realms on the fertile soil of the Levant. These individuals formed the leadership of the crusade, along with many others. Through these networks, the message of the crusade spread throughout continental Europe, and the Pope urged his bishops and legates to carry it along to their own dioceses in France, Germany, and Italy. Typically, preaching would conclude with every volunteer taking a vow to complete a pilgrimage to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, as Adhemar had done. And at that point, taking the cross had become both a symbolic and a literal act, as everyone who took the oath was often given a cross that was usually sewed onto their clothing. The expedition was scheduled to depart on the 15th of August 1096, the day of the Catholic Feast of the Assumption. But not everyone was operating with the consent of the Church. Pope Urban had unleashed forces that were far beyond his ability to control, or even imagine, bringing chaos from the unintended consequences. In May 1096, a crusader known as Emico of Flaunheim led targeted attacks on Jews in the German towns of Speyer and Worms. And by the end of the month, gangs of crusader thugs had traveled there from other regions of France and Germany to join him in destroying the Jewish community of the town of Mainz, before heading towards Cologne to continue their rampage. An extremist priest in Bohemia formed a small army that led similar attacks further east. Emico and the main group were finally stopped after they wandered across the Hungarian border, and were massacred by Koloman and his army when they discovered that the mob was pillaging the countryside of his lands. Meanwhile, a much larger mob was converging on Constantinople several months before the departure of the official crusade. This was the so-called People's Crusade, led by a charismatic priest named Peter the Hermit, who had created a fanaticism among his followers, an army of mostly untrained peasants, as well as some nobles, including a small group of professionally trained knights. And to no one's surprise, it was a disaster. After pillaging the countryside around Constantinople and getting into a skirmish with Roman troops sent to quell their attacks, the peasant mob wandered into Seljuk territory in Western Asia, where they were then massacred by the Turks. Finally, the official crusade departed in August, setting out from northern and southern France, Flanders, Germany, and southern Italy. And by the time they arrived in Constantinople, all four armies were already exhausted. As for Emperor Alexios, his goal was to ferry the Crusaders across the Bosphorus to Asia as quickly as possible, as he wanted them out of his capital. He had already been informed that Bohemond of Taranto was among them. Of course, Bohemond was a Norman, and like many Normans, he also happened to be a sworn enemy of the Roman state, having invaded its borders on numerous occasions alongside his father, and had even attempted to organize an attack on Constantinople on one occasion while encamped outside the city. Alexios made the crusade leaders swear an oath of fealty to him, promising to return to the Eastern Roman Empire any lands they managed to recover from the Turks. After that, their combined armies were hastily transported across the Bosporus, where they landed in Anatolia, officially crossing into Asia. The first objective of the expedition was Nicaea, once a major Roman city that had recently become the new capital of the Islamic Sultanate of Rum, since the city's capture by the Seljuk Turks. The Crusaders reached Nicaea by mid-May 1097 to find that the Seljuk ruler Kilij Arslan was away from his capital campaigning against the Danishmends in central Anatolia. As soon as he was informed the Crusaders had besieged Nicaea, he raced back to the city and attacked the Crusaders outside its walls just 2 days later. Arslan had underestimated the size of the Crusader forces, and his army was driven back in the ensuing battle, resulting in heavy losses on both sides. The Crusaders continued their siege. Nicaea was situated on an enormous lake, and the Crusaders simply did not have the manpower or the resources to blockade the lake, as they had no ships there. However, Emperor Alexios arranged to have their ships transported overland on top of rolling logs. The Seljuk garrison at Nicaea had clearly not expected that such a thing was even a possibility, and the sight of the ships was so shocking to them that the Turks surrendered to the Crusaders in June, about a month after the siege had begun. By the end of June, the Crusaders were marching on through Anatolia, accompanied by a small contingent of Roman troops, commanded by 2 generals sent along with the Crusaders by the Emperor. The Crusaders were marching in 2 separate groups, led by the French and the Normans respectively, and the Norman army had marched ahead of the other group, planning to meet again at Dorylaeum. But the Normans were attacked by Kilij Arslan, who had gathered a much larger army, and his fast-moving mounted archers had surrounded their forces already by the time they had begun firing at the Crusaders. The Normans immediately deployed a tight defensive formation, surrounding all their equipment and the non-combatants traveling with them, and they sent out a messenger to alert the other group further behind them. The French-led army arrived sooner than the Turks had expected, and while Godfrey successfully broke through the Turkish lines, Athemar outflanked them from the rear. Caught by surprise, the Turks fled rather than face the combined Crusader forces. The Crusaders marched through Anatolia unopposed after that, but it was an extremely grueling journey, as the Turks had burned and destroyed everything in the countryside as they fled. It was the middle of summer, and the Crusaders began losing men and horses as food and water ran dangerously low. But some among the Crusade leadership had made their own plans. In fact, Baldwin of Boulogne and Norman mercenary Tancred had both made their own separate plans to carve out fiefdoms for themselves completely independently of each other, and raced off to mountainous Armenia at the head of 2 separate contingents shortly after the Crusader armies passed through the Cilician gates. Tancred was the first of the 2 to arrive at Tarsus. The city was held by the Seljuk Turks, but the local garrison did not want to fight, and after some negotiations they allowed Tancred to raise his flag above the citadel. But when Baldwin arrived outside Tarsus the following day with his men, he managed to persuade the Seljuk garrison to let him capture 2 towers along the city walls, likely because his forces heavily outnumbered Tancred and his men. Tancred knew he would very likely be defeated and did not wish to engage in all-out battle with another crusader. Especially with the Turks still present, he and his men withdrew from Tarsus and moved on. Shortly thereafter, a group of Norman knights arrived outside the city gates, perhaps thinking Tancred was still in control of Tarsus. But Baldwin denied them entry and refused to open the city gates, fearing they would try to take the city from him. That night, the Seljuk garrison slaughtered the Normans at their encampment outside the city. In retaliation, Baldwin's men then massacred the Turks. Knowing his men would blame him for what happened to the Normans, Baldwin hastily took shelter in a tower and eventually managed to convince his soldiers of his innocence. Then, more good fortune came to Baldwin when a pirate captain called Guynemer of Boulogne sailed up the river to Tarsus with his fleet and swore fealty to Baldwin. Of course, Baldwin was glad to accept the oath. He immediately hired Guynemer and his mercenaries to garrison the city for him while he continued his campaign. Meanwhile, Tancred had captured the nearby town of Mamistra. Since learning of the massacre of the Normans, many of Tancred's men sought revenge, and when Baldwin arrived in Mamistra at the end of September, a fight broke out between his and Tancred's soldiers. Deciding Mamistra wasn't worth an all-out battle, Baldwin gave up and left. Baldwin continued his campaign in the mountains of Armenia throughout the month of October, where he and his troops were warmly welcomed by the populations of the towns he passed through. In advance of Baldwin's arrival, the local people massacred the Seljuk Turk garrison stationed at the fortresses of Ravendal and Terbessel, and handed them over to Baldwin when he and his forces arrived at the end of 1097. At the beginning of the following year, the Armenian Lord Thoros of Edessa sent envoys to request military assistance from Baldwin in dealing with a local Turk warlord named Balduk, the emir of nearby Semisada. Baldwin agreed and set out for Edessa in February, harassed during his journey by Balduk's forces. Baldwin arrived in Edessa to a warm welcome by Thoros and the local population. Thoros adopted Baldwin and appointed him co-regent of Edessa. And with reinforcements from Thoros' army, Baldwin led his forces in a raid into territory controlled by Balduk, where he installed a garrison in a small fortress near Semisada. But unfortunately for Thoros, Baldwin was a cold-blooded opportunist, loyal only to himself. So when a faction of the local nobility in Edessa began plotting against Thoros, Baldwin was content to let it happen. The nobles instigated a riot, forcing Thoros to retreat into the citadel. When the rioters finally breached the stronghold, Baldwin did nothing to stop them as they murdered both Thoros and his wife. The following day, the people of Edessa recognized Baldwin as their ruler. Baldwin assumed the title Count of Edessa, establishing the first Crusader state. Baldwin took possession of the rich treasury of Edessa and used a portion of the funds to hire a mercenary army to bolster the city's defenses. He made peace with Balduk and purchased Semisada from him, allowing the former emir to continue ruling the region as his local governor. Baldwin had become a formidable regional warlord practically overnight. He was first challenged by Kerboga, the Seljuk ruler of Mesopotamia, who arrived one day outside the walls of Edessa with an enormous army. But after besieging the city for 3 weeks without any progress, Kerboga gave up and moved on, as he had expected the city to fall quickly and was unprepared for a prolonged siege. Meanwhile, the main Crusader army was preparing for the next objective of their campaign, Antioch. Located midway between Constantinople and Jerusalem, the city of Antioch was enormous, and the sight of its walls must have been intimidating as they approached. The French nobleman Stephen of Blois described it in a letter, writing that the city of Antioch was very extensive, fortified with incredible strength and almost impregnable. In fact, the Crusaders had nowhere near enough troops to fully encircle the city's perimeter, and were unable to completely stop provisions from entering. The Crusade leaders knew the only way they could ever hope to capture Antioch was if they could somehow force a capitulation from its defenders, or better yet, if they could find a traitor within the city who was willing to help them get inside. Still without any real plan, the Crusaders began their siege of Antioch. 8 months later, it was already a disaster. The Crusaders were suffering from starvation, and in their desperation had tried engaging in rituals such as procession and repetitive prayer, as instructed by Adhemar, as he was convinced they were being punished for their sinful nature. Meanwhile, the Crusaders implemented foraging systems to ease the food situation, which managed to keep them alive long enough for Crusader forces to capture the Syrian ports of Latakia and St. Simeon, allowing supply ships to deliver much-needed provisions to the Crusaders. Meanwhile, the Crusader forces managed to hold their position, defeating an army sent against them by Dukak of Damascus. Following the defeat of his army, his brother Ridwan dispatched his own army to Antioch, but failed to dislodge the Crusaders as well. But the siege still had yet to make any real progress, and this would not change for the few months that followed. Finally, Bohemund of Tarenta managed to find an insider named Firuz, an Armenian Christian responsible for defending a section of the city wall. Firuz opened one of the city gates to allow Bohemund and a small party of trained Norman knights to quietly enter, and as soon as they were in position, Firuz gave the signal. Suddenly the sound of horns blared throughout Antioch, at which point several members of the city's Christian majority opened the other gates, allowing the rest of the Crusaders to enter the city. What followed was a frenzy of killing, in which the Crusaders rampaged through Antioch, slaughtering almost all of the city's Muslim inhabitants by the time they were finished, along with many Christians killed by mistake in the confusion. But the fight over Antioch was not over yet. The Crusaders had broken into and occupied the city, but the real test would determine whether or not they were capable of defending their position and holding it. And it just so happened that the Seljuk warlord Kerboga was marching towards Antioch with his army after failing to capture Edessa in the north. Kerboga arrived outside the walls of Antioch with an army of 40,000, and they wasted no time in launching wave after wave of attacks, as Kerboga's forces relentlessly assaulted the city walls from dawn until dusk without rest for 4 days straight. When this failed to breach the city walls, Kerboga changed tactics and decided he would simply wait and starve Antioch into submission. On the 24th of June, Kerboga rejected a proposed peace offer from the Crusaders. With no other options left, the Crusade leaders decided they would rather die fighting their way out of the city than starve, and decided to make one final attempt to break out of Antioch. On the 28th, the Crusader forces arranged themselves into 4 battle groups and marched out of the city at dawn to confront the enemy. Kerboga observed them as they exited through the city gates, planning to annihilate them as soon as they were out in the open. But Kerboga's soldiers were undisciplined and overconfident due to their sheer size, outnumbering the Crusaders 2-1. These combined factors resulted in a disorderly and badly coordinated response by Kerboga's army. Unable to overrun the Crusaders, Muslim soldiers attacking the bridge gate suddenly broke and fled through the advancing main body of their own army. This triggered an instant wave of panic that quickly spread throughout Kerboga's forces, and his soldiers broke and fled the battle, despite suffering from very few casualties at that point. Against all odds, the Crusaders had captured Antioch. But the Crusade leaders began quarreling over which of them would rule in Antioch, and the expedition was delayed as they argued. Meanwhile, a deadly plague broke out in the city and killed Adhemar of Lepi, as well as many soldiers and horses. And there were other problems too. The Muslim peasants living in the surrounding countryside were refusing to supply the Crusaders with food. As nobility, the Crusade leaders relied on the labor of peasant serfs living on the lands they controlled, so this was a serious problem, considering the rural population was almost entirely Muslim. Now that Adhemar was gone, the primary contenders for control of Antioch were Bohund of Taranto and Raymond IV of Toulouse, but Bohemund eventually won the political struggle. Thus Bohemund was crowned the first prince of Antioch, the second Crusader state. The Crusader army then departed and began the march to Jerusalem, heading south down the Mediterranean coast. The Crusaders faced little resistance as they passed through the territories of various local rulers, who preferred to simply make peace and furnish their armies with supplies, rather than risk defeat in battle or the pillaging of their lands. Meanwhile, Raymond was making plans of his own. He was determined to carve out his own realm in the Holy Land, and the one resource he had was money. So he began recruiting other Crusaders as hired mercenaries, intending to retain them as his vassals once they helped him score his own fiefdom in the Holy Land. Raymond had his eyes set on Tripoli, a wealthy city on the coast of the Levant, but first he would capture the strategic city of Arca in northern Lebanon. He and his forces besieged the city, confident that its defenders would capitulate quickly. But by mid-May, Raymond had yet to make any progress after a 3-month stalemate. And by the time he finally gave up, many of his vassals had left his service to join with Godfrey of Bouillon, who was consolidating his own fiefdom in alliance with his ruthless warlord brother Baldwin, who still ruled in faraway Edessa. The Crusaders continued south down the coast, passing through Beirut on the 19th of May, and by ancient Tyre on the 23rd. Turning inland at Jaffa, they reached Ramla at the beginning of June to find the city abandoned. Robert Curthose and Tancred were some of the Crusaders who had left Raymond in favor of Godfrey, and it was already paying off for them. Godfrey sent Tancred to capture the town of Bethlehem, a place sacred to Christians. As soon as he captured the town, Tancred raised his banner above the Church of the Nativity. The Crusaders finally reached Jerusalem on the 7th of June 1099. Some of them reportedly wept upon seeing the city in the distance. They had finally made it. Since the previous year, Jerusalem was no longer in the hands of the Seljuk Turks, and had since been recaptured by a Fatimid army. In fact, the Caliphate's local rulers in Jerusalem tried to make a deal with the Crusade leaders, promising freedom of passage to any Christian pilgrims, as long as the Crusaders did not invade their borders. But the Crusaders never cared about the plight of Christian pilgrims. They had come to the Holy Land to enrich themselves with land, loot, or anything else they were able to take during their journey. They were determined to capture Jerusalem, and there was absolutely nothing on earth that was going to stop them. The countryside surrounding the city was arid and devoid of food, water, and anything else they could have used for supplies. And the local Fatimid governor had poisoned almost every well around the outskirts of Jerusalem in advance of their arrival. The Crusader forces were significantly reduced by that point, and they did not have the manpower to blockade the city in a siege, as they normally would have done. This time, the only option was to capture the city in a direct assault, and they would have to do it with just 12,000 men, including about 1,500 cavalry. And so, not knowing how exactly they were going to proceed, the Crusaders prepared for the final objective of their expedition. Thus began the attack on Jerusalem. As Godfrey and his forces made their camp to the north of the city, Raymond and his few remaining vassals were encamped on the opposite side to the south. Having failed to seize Tripoli and Arca, Raymond knew Jerusalem was his only chance to seize land for himself in the Levant. If he could break through the southern wall while everyone else was distracted with the assault on the northern side of the city, Raymond might be able to secure an early surrender, which could put him in a position to rule Jerusalem himself. And so, while Raymond and his forces began their assault on the southern wall, Godfrey and the bulk of the Crusader army simultaneously attacked from the north. However, the initial assault was more speculative than determined. On the northern side, the Crusaders managed to successfully scale the outer wall, but were quickly repulsed from the inner wall by the city's defenders, forcing the attackers to retreat and regroup. The leadership agreed they would need a more coordinated strategy if they wanted to capture Jerusalem. Then, the Crusaders received word that a Fatimid relief army was on its way from Egypt, leaving a narrow window of time to capture the city before its arrival. The final assault began in July, about a month after the Crusaders reached Jerusalem. Raymond and his troops began the attack from the south, and the attackers on the northern wall began their assault shortly thereafter. The fighting dragged on for 2 bloody days without much progress on either side of the city. Finally, the Crusaders breached the perimeter and managed to capture the inner rampart of the northern wall. Once the Crusaders occupied that section of the city walls, its remaining defenders panicked and fled their posts rather than face the Crusaders in close combat. Once they saw what was happening on the northern side, the defenders of the southern wall abandoned their posts as well. And as soon as they fled, Raymond and his troops quickly entered Jerusalem from its unguarded southern gate. The city's local rulers retreated behind the walls of the citadel, including the Fatimid governor Iftikhar al-Dawla, who also commanded the local garrison, and after some negotiations he was able to work out a deal with Raymond. The Fatimid garrison surrendered the citadel and Jerusalem itself, and Raymond upheld his part by allowing everyone within the citadel to safely depart Jerusalem. They were among the few survivors. The common people were not so lucky. As they had in Antioch, the Crusaders unleashed a tidal wave of violence against the people of Jerusalem, killing any suspected Muslims on sight. When several of the city's defenders took refuge within the Al-Aqsa Mosque, Tancred and his men massacred everyone inside. Jews in the city suffered the same fate, as the Crusaders considered them no less enemies of Christ than the Muslims. And when most of the city's Jews retreated into their synagogue, the Crusaders burned it to the ground while they were trapped inside. Aside from the Fatimid administrators who had negotiated their safe passage out of the city, the only Jews or Muslims who survived the sack of Jerusalem were those with high enough status for the Crusaders to ransom. When they were finished with their rampage, the Crusade leaders held a council within the Church of the Holy Sepulchre on the 22nd of July. Now that they had captured Jerusalem, the Crusaders needed to form a government to manage their new Christian state. At that point, Raymond was well aware that he had lost the support and influence he once enjoyed among the Crusade leadership, especially after his failure to capture Arca. In one final effort to prevent Godfrey from becoming the ruler of the city, Raymond declared that he himself would refuse any crown offered to him, as Christ wore only a crown of thorns during his time in Jerusalem. The Crusade leaders were in agreement. However, the only obvious ecclesiastical candidate who could establish a religious lordship over the city was the Greek patriarch of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, who had died recently. Ultimately, the council agreed to decide who would rule by simple majority vote, at which point Raymond knew he had no chance. Most of the council was composed of Godfrey's men, the knights from Lorraine and France. Needless to say, the council elected Godfrey as the first ruler of Christian Jerusalem. And to Raymond's annoyance, Godfrey refused the crown as well, instead assuming his new Latin title of Advocatus Sancti Sepulchri, or Defender of the Holy Sepulchre. And just like that, Jerusalem became the third Crusader state. Raymond ultimately refused to recognize Godfrey as ruler, and he departed Jerusalem in frustration after a failed final attempt to capture the Tower of David. Despite his failure to achieve any of his goals, Raymond had completed his vows, and could have returned home in honor. But he was bitter and determined not to leave the Holy Land until he had secured his own fiefdom there. Raymond decided he would make one more attempt at capturing Arca in the north, and he besieged the city again in 1100. Once again, it quickly became a lengthy and frustrating stalemate, and the city's defenders were determined to prevent its capture. The siege lasted into the following year before Raymond had to give up for a second time, as he was running low on supplies and money. Undeterred, Raymond moved on to Tripoli itself, which had always been his main goal. He built a strategic fortress near the city, known as Mont Peregrinus, which he and his forces used as a base from which to maintain pressure on Tripoli. And when Raymond was killed while trying to capture the city in 1105, his heirs continued the campaign. Finally, his son Bertrand captured Tripoli in 1109 and became its ruler, establishing the fourth and final Crusader state. Meanwhile, Godfrey of Bouillon died about a year after becoming the ruler of Jerusalem. And when a papal legate tried to establish a theocratic regime under the direct control of the papacy, the knights from Lorraine prevented him from doing so. They threw their support behind Baldwin instead, and he was recalled from Edessa to succeed his brother as ruler. But unlike Godfrey, Baldwin had no issues with the title of king, and on Christmas Day, 1100, Baldwin of Bouillon was crowned in Bethlehem, becoming the first Latin king of Jerusalem, establishing the Christian state as a secular kingdom. Thus, the Crusader states were the county of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem, joined by the county of Tripoli in 1109. As for Pope Urban, he did live long enough to see Jerusalem under Christian rule. Unfortunately, the news had not yet reached him, and he died 2 weeks after its capture without ever knowing it had happened. Meanwhile, Constantinople was eager to recapture its lost territories, and Antioch was of particular importance. Alexios sent a Roman army to Antioch, but Bohemond managed to repel them. Knowing that would not be the end of it, Bohemond returned to southern Italy, where he became a sworn enemy of Constantinople once again, leaving his nephew Tancred to rule Antioch in his absence. Bohemond launched a campaign to gather support for his new war against the Eastern Roman Empire, and managed to secure the support of the new pope, Paschal II. In 1107, Bohemond invaded Roman territory in the Western Balkans, where he targeted the city of Dyrrhachium, where his father Robert Guisacard had waged his own campaign against the Eastern Romans decades earlier. Bohemond sought to expand his influence, intending to carve out a Norman principality in southern Italy. But these efforts failed, and following his defeat by a Roman army, Bohemond was forced to sign a treaty in which the Principality of Antioch became a vassal state of Constantinople. But Tancred ignored the treaty and refused to recognize Roman dominance over Antioch. He strengthened its defenses and even led successful military campaigns that expanded its territory further. He continued to act independently in defiance of Constantinople, and the Principality of Antioch would remain an independent state due to his effective governance. The Crusade reshaped the medieval world, forging new states, igniting centuries of conflict, and leaving a legacy that echoed far beyond the walls of Jerusalem. For the Crusaders, it was a triumph of faith, but for many it was also a story of ambition, rivalry, and sacrifice. And as the dust of the battlefield settled, the Crusader state stood as a fragile reminder of both the heights of religious fervor and the complexities of human behavior. The journey may have ended, but the ripples of the Crusade would continue to shape history for generations to come. After all, Jerusalem wasn't going anywhere anytime soon, and there was always next time.